December 10th, 1941. The skies over Luzon, Philippines, trembled under the first full wave of Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Below, the charred remains of Clark Field smoldered. American aircraft, neat rows of B-17 flying fortresses, lay broken and burning under the tropical sun. The smell of oil and cordite clung to the air. For the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, it was proof that the enemy's flying fortress was little more than an oversized target. From the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, Lieutenant Saburo Takeda laughed as he banked hard over the smoking airfield. "Fortress?" he sneered into his radio. "More like a coffin." His wingman chuckled. The B-17s they'd seen were slow, ungainly machines. Giant four-engine bombers lumbering through the sky, while nimble Zeros sliced around them like hawks among cattle. That was the story spreading across every Japanese airbase from Formosa to Rabaul. The Americans had put their faith in a flying brick. The truth, however, was more complicated. Even as smoke curled over the Philippines, at airfields from Hawaii to Australia, new crews were forming, men who had never seen combat, stepping into machines that would soon define their courage. Captain William "Red" Carmichael, 26 years old, sat in the cockpit of a B-17E nicknamed Lucky Lady. He ran his hand along the throttle levers, feeling the vibration of the Wright Cyclone engines roaring to life. The flying fortress was an imposing sight, 9 feet of aluminum, bristling with machine guns, its massive frame gleaming beneath the tropical sun. Around him, the aircrew prepared for what would be one of the first long-range bombing missions of the Pacific Campaign. An attack on Japanese shipping off the coast of Mindanao. As the formation lifted off from Del Monte Field, they climbed steadily through layers of humidity, breaking into clear air. Inside the cabin, the crew went silent. The only sounds were the drone of 4 engines and the occasional static from the radio. Each man had a role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunners, all bound together by aluminum skin and trust. At 18,000 feet, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the inside of the window frames. The men wore fleece-lined jackets, goggles frosting with each breath. Ahead, the sea stretched endlessly. Somewhere below waited the Imperial Navy. "Target in sight," came the call from the nose compartment. Moments later, the bombardier opened the bomb bay doors. The wind screamed through the fuselage. Bombs tumbled into the sky, vanishing into the blue, before streaks of black smoke erupted across the horizon. Ships burned. The fortress shuddered as anti-aircraft fire clawed at the air around them. And then, bandits, 3 o'clock high. The Japanese fighters appeared suddenly, like wasps from the sun, sleek, silver, and merciless. Tracers stitched the sky. The first burst tore across the B-17's fuselage, smashing into the left wing and riddling the tail with holes. The fortress lurched violently, but Carmichael held her steady. The gunners responded with fury. Twin 50-caliber machine guns thundered from the top turret. Brass casings rattled across the floor. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. Inside 1-0, Lieutenant Takeda lined up for another pass. He squeezed the trigger, bullets slamming into the bomber's nose. To his astonishment, the massive aircraft kept flying, engines smoking, but formation intact. He pulled up sharply to avoid colliding with it, his radio filled with the panicked chatter of other pilots. "Impossible," one shouted. "She won't fall." Carmichael's co-pilot looked out the side window and shouted over the noise. "They're throwing everything they've got, Red." Carmichael grinned through gritted teeth. "Then we'll give them a show." The B-17 held course, turning toward the open sea. Flames licked at one wing, yet the aircraft refused to die. Each man aboard braced for impact, but none came. After 40 minutes of relentless attack, the Zeros broke off, low on fuel. When Lucky Lady limped back over friendly territory, her fuselage looked like a sieve. Hundreds of holes punched clean through her frame, but she was alive, and so were they. At the airfield, mechanics stared in disbelief as the battered bomber touched down, one wheel collapsing under her weight. Crews rushed forward, some cheering, others silent. The Japanese had laughed. But the flying fortress had come back. Word spread fast, across the Philippines, across the Pacific. The flying fortress had earned her name. By January 1942, the B-17 was no longer seen as a clumsy machine. She was a survivor. Her thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 10 machine guns made her a fortress indeed, one that could take punishment and still bring her men home. For the Japanese pilots, what had begun as arrogance was turning into uneasy respect. The war in the Pacific was changing, and the B-17 would soon become its symbol of defiance. February 3rd, 1942. Over the Java Sea, the air shimmered in the tropical heat, broken only by the rhythmic hum of 4 Wright cyclone engines turning at full throttle. 20,000 feet above the endless water, 6 B-17Es of the U.S. Army Air Force's 19th Bomb Group droned toward their target, a Japanese convoy steaming toward Balikpapan. In the lead ship, Miss Emmeline, Captain Red Carmichael adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon. Below him, tiny white wakes spread like scratches across a pane of blue glass. He could already see the flashes from anti-aircraft guns on the ships, tiny sparks against the sea, but deadly all the same. The bomber formation closed ranks. Through the narrow slit of the Norden bomb site, the world seemed peaceful, almost serene, until the first shells burst among them. Black puffs of shrapnel tore through the air, rocking the fortress. Fragments pinged against the fuselage like stones on a tin roof. "Flak! 11 o'clock low!" The intercom crackled with voices. The top turret gunner racked the charging handles of his .50 caliber Brownings. Spent casings clattered to the floor as he fired a warning burst at the sky, the vibration rumbling through the frame. Then came the fighters. Zeros, rising from the east, their wings flashing silver in the sun. They climbed swiftly, diving at the lumbering bombers in tight spirals, tracers streaking past the cockpits. "Bandits, high 6, coming in fast." The tail gunner swung his twin guns into position. The sound was deafening, a rolling hammer beat that filled the fuselage. His bursts caught 1-0 as it curved into a head-on pass. The Japanese plane flared, trailing smoke, spinning toward the sea. But there were more. Always more. The B-17s rocked under the impacts, engines coughing, hydraulic lines severed, aluminum skin torn like paper. One bomber slid out of formation, smoke pouring from its number 3 engine. The pilot's voice came over the radio, calm but final. "She's done. Tell the boys we'll try for land." Moments later, the sea swallowed her. Still, Carmichael's formation pressed on. Bomb bay doors opened, the howl of the wind filling every compartment. Below, the convoy scattered, plumes of water rising where bombs hit close. A freighter erupted in flame, another began to list, black smoke curling from its decks. "Bombs away!" the bombardiers shouted. Carmichael leveled off, engines straining. He could feel every vibration, every jolt of flak bursting beneath them. But somehow the ship kept flying. When they finally turned for home, the sky behind them was chaos. Burning ships, parachutes descending, drifting smoke columns marking where men had fallen. The fortress climbed, heavy and slow, one prop feathered, fuselage peppered with holes. Inside, the crew counted 12 separate hits. The radio operator was bleeding from shrapnel. The right waist gunner's jacket was scorched. Yet the plane still flew. Hours later, Miss Emmeline touched down at Singosari Airfield, landing gear barely holding. Mechanics ran to her side, their faces frozen in disbelief. The aircraft looked shredded, her wings pocked with holes, one engine almost destroyed. Carmichael shut down the throttles, the cockpit filling with smoke. He removed his oxygen mask, took one long breath, and muttered, "She brought us home again." Half a world away, in Rabaul, the Japanese Navy was re-evaluating everything. Reports from pilots told the same story over and over. The American B-17 was slow, but unkillable. It could lose an engine, a tail section, a dozen feet of wing, and still make it back to base. Imperial officers scoffed at first. Surely their aces had simply failed to finish the job. But photographs from reconnaissance flights told another tale. Wrecked Japanese ships, bombed ports, and a bomber campaign that refused to die. Colonel Takeda, the same pilot who had once mocked the flying coffins over Luzon, now sat in silence in the command tent. Before him, a Japanese intelligence officer placed a charred fragment of aluminum skin on the table, riddled with bullet holes, but still intact. "This was recovered from a crash site near Davao," the officer said. "A flying fortress. It flew over 200 miles after taking this damage." Takeda leaned closer. He could still smell the oil and salt on the metal. 200 miles? "Yes, Colonel. And it dropped its bombs before it went down." For the first time, Takeda didn't laugh. He stared at the warped metal and realized that Japan's air war in the Pacific would not be one of easy victories. The Americans had built something terrifying, not because it was perfect, but because it refused to die. By the spring of 1942, Tokyo's pilots no longer dismissed the fortress. They respected it and feared it. But for the men flying inside those aluminum hulls, the cost of that respect would be paid in blood. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal. The island rose out of the ocean like a scar, its jungles blackened by smoke, the beaches strewn with wrecks, its airfields little more than strips of dirt carved from chaos. From the sea, the low thrum of engines approached, deep, heavy, and unmistakable. A flight of B-17Es from the 11th Bomb Group, the Gray Geese, thundered toward the target. Japanese supply convoys off Tulagi. Sunlight glinted off their wings as they climbed above the scattered clouds. From a distance, they looked almost graceful, like massive silver birds gliding over the war-torn Pacific. But inside those aircraft, men sweated in the heat, every movement damp with tension. The fortress had changed since the first chaotic months of the war. It was tougher now, better armed, better crewed, and flown by men who had learned the hard way that survival was a kind of art. In the lead bomber, the Iron Duchess, Captain Robert "Bobby" Hanley adjusted his flight goggles and glanced at the formation behind him. 12 ships, each bristling with 10 to 12 50-caliber machine guns, their barrels dark against the glaring sky. Below, the sea shimmered, hiding death beneath its surface. Japanese destroyers zigzagged across the water, their guns already flashing in defiance. "Flak ahead," the bombardier called out. Hanley steadied the fortress. The first bursts came moments later, black blossoms rising violently between the bombers. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage like hailstones. One fragment tore through the side of the cockpit, narrowly missing Hanley's arm. He flinched, but didn't speak. "Bomb bay doors open!" The mechanical groan filled the cabin. The bombardier peered through his sight. The crosshairs drifted across a Japanese freighter. Steady, steady. Then the world exploded into motion. Zeros were climbing fast, tiny darting specks against the blinding light. Their tracer rounds arced upward, a storm of fire meeting the descending bombs. The first bombs hit home, lifting columns of water and smoke skyward. A ship listed violently, flames licking its deck. Another turned sharply, trying to evade, but too late. Hanley's gunner shouted, "They're coming in from above!" The sky erupted. The top turret fired, twin streams of tracers cutting across the air. The fortress shuddered under the recoil, The tail gunner screamed as a burst ripped across his section, punching holes the size of fists in the metal skin, but the tail stayed on. Hanley forced the Fortress higher, throttles wide open. The engines roared, coughing smoke. A Zero dove passed, its pilot grinning, until his canopy exploded under a hail of .50 caliber fire from the right waist gun. For 2 minutes, the air was pure violence. Gunfire, smoke, and screaming engines. Then, as suddenly as it began, the fighters broke off, trailing smoke toward the horizon. Inside the Iron Duchess, silence fell except for the steady hum of the engines. The crew looked around. Every man still alive. Every station bloodied but functional. The navigator exhaled shakily. They hit everything but the heart. Hanley smiled grimly. That's why they call her a fortress. Back at Henderson Field, the battered fortresses landed one by one. Their wings shot to pieces, windows shattered, paint scorched by flak. Mechanics counted bullet holes like tally marks of survival, sometimes 100, sometimes 200. Word spread fast. Even the Marines stationed on the island gathered to watch the bombers return, cheering as each one touched down. It was becoming a ritual. These massive, wounded machines limping home from impossible missions, engines wheezing, but spirits unbroken. The Japanese, however, were not cheering. From Raboul's war rooms, officers watched reconnaissance photos that showed their convoys shattered again and again by American bombers. The enemy's lumbering fortresses were inflicting damage far out of proportion to their numbers. The Imperial Navy began calling them Oni no Hikoki, the demon planes. Pilots who had once mocked the fortress now prayed not to meet it. Night over the Pacific. A crippled B-17, Heaven Can Wait, flew home alone through sheets of rain. Her number 2 engine was dead, her tail gunner unconscious. Lightning flashed, illuminating holes the size of fists in her fuselage. The co-pilot leaned toward the intercom. "We've lost hydraulic pressure. We can't lower the gear." "Then we land on the belly," the pilot replied, his voice calm. "Get ready." The aircraft descended through the storm. Wind howled through open seams in the fuselage. The pilot could barely see the airstrip, lit only by oil drum fires along the edges. The wheels stayed locked in place, useless. At the last moment, the pilot throttled down. The Fortress struck the ground with a shriek of metal, sparks flying across the runway as the belly scraped the dirt. It skidded nearly 300 yards before grinding to a halt in a shower of mud and flame. For a second, there was silence. Then, one by one, the crew emerged, soaked, blackened, but alive. A Marine standing nearby whispered, "God Almighty, she still flies." And that was how legends were born. Not from invincibility, but from endurance. Across the Pacific, wherever American airmen gathered, stories of the Fortress spread like gospel. Of bombers limping back on 3 engines, of crews bailing fuel with their hands, of a plane so strong it could fly halfway home missing a wingtip. Each story began the same way. "You won't believe this, but the Fortress came back." The laughter of the early war years was gone now, replaced by something else: respect, fear, and the first quiet recognition that Japan's war in the air was beginning to tilt toward disaster. October 15th, 1942. Over the Solomon Islands, the clouds hung low and bruised, heavy with tropical rain. Below them stretched a sea mottled with sunlight and oil slicks, a graveyard of ships that had once carried the rising sun. High above, 5 B-17Fs droned eastward, their silver skins dulled by salt and smoke. In the lead ship, Memphis Belle's sister aircraft, the Mary Jane, Captain Red Carmichael, his once fiery red hair now streaked with gray from stress and exhaustion, gripped the yoke tighter than ever. His crew had flown 23 missions, and everyone felt like it could have been their last. Inside the bomber, everything rattled. The metal floorboards, the bomb racks, even the thin oxygen lines frosting over at altitude. The smell of sweat and burnt cordite had become part of the plane itself. "Approaching Raboul," the navigator called out. Carmichael looked down through the drifting gaps in the clouds. The Japanese fortress port below crawled with anti-aircraft guns and fighters waiting on the runway. It was, as always, a suicide run, but the orders were clear. Cripple the fuel depots. Delay Japan's advance. Hold the line. "Open bomb doors," Carmichael commanded. The whine of the hydraulic systems filled the ship. As the Mary Jane rolled into her attack run, the sky lit up with flak. Black bursts dotted the clouds. The sound wasn't thunder. It was sharper, harder, the sound of air being torn apart. The bombardier, Lieutenant Hayes, leaned over the Norden's sight, speaking in short bursts. "Steady, steady, bombs away." A second later, the aircraft jolted as the bomb load dropped free. But before they could pull away, the world exploded. A direct hit. Flak tore through the left wing, shredding the control surfaces and punching holes the size of fists in the fuselage. One engine began to cough flame. The radio operator screamed as debris tore through the compartment. Carmichael's headset crackled, panic and gunfire in every voice. "Number 3 engine's on fire. Tail section's hit. We're losing altitude," he shouted back. "Feather it and hold formation." Smoke filled the cockpit. The heat was unbearable. He could barely see the horizon through the haze of burning oil. A pair of Zeros dove through the chaos, guns blazing. Their tracers stitched across the bomber's nose, shattering glass. The co-pilot slumped forward, blood streaking his flight jacket. The fortress rocked violently, but didn't fall. Carmichael gritted his teeth, slamming the throttles forward on the remaining engines. "Come on, girl. Don't quit now." The top turret roared to life. Sergeant Daniels opened fire, the twin Brownings hammering out a defiant rhythm. 1 Zero burst into flames, spiraling down. The second pulled away, smoke trailing from its wing. Inside the ship, it was chaos. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the deck, mixing with blood. Oxygen masks dangled loose. The intercom sputtered with static. But somehow, the Mary Jane still clawed her way higher, away from Raboul's black smoke. For the next 2 hours, the bomber limped home. 3 engines straining, tail shredded, 1 aileron jammed. Every gust of wind felt like it might be the one to finish them. The navigator whispered, almost to himself, "She can't make it." Carmichael didn't answer. He only stared straight ahead, his hands trembling on the controls. By dusk, the coast of Guadalcanal appeared, green and gold in the fading light. Marines on the beach looked up and pointed. A blackened shape staggered through the clouds, one wing dipping low. Smoke poured from its engines. The tail was barely holding. The fortress came in low, skimming the treetops. The wheels locked down only halfway. When she touched the runway, one landing gear collapsed instantly. The aircraft spun, sparks flying from the belly as metal screamed against earth. Then silence. The crew stumbled out one by one, bloody, limping, alive. Mechanics rushed forward. Someone shouted, "She made it! Holy hell, she made it!" The B-17's left wing was a skeleton of torn metal. Over 300 holes had been counted later, and yet she had flown nearly 600 miles home. The Japanese commanders who reviewed the intercepted reports didn't laugh anymore. One pilot's final transmission had described it best. "We hit her again and again. She burns, she bleeds, but she will not die." Weeks later, a Tokyo intelligence summary reached Admiral Yamamoto's desk. It described the American heavy bomber's capabilities in meticulous detail. Range, armor, crew discipline, and psychological effect. The report ended with a single line. "The enemy's flying fortress demonstrates a spirit equal to its name. We must not underestimate the will of such men." By 1943, the flying fortress was no longer just an airplane, it was a symbol. In the Pacific, It was the ghost that haunted every Japanese convoy. In America, it was the beating heart of propaganda reels and recruitment drives. The footage of battered fortresses landing on one wheel, wings torn to ribbons, filled newsreels across the United States. The message was unmistakable. The fortress always comes home. Mothers wrote to air bases thanking the crews. School children sent letters addressed simply to the men who fly the fortresses. And somewhere in the Solomons, Red Carmichael sat beside what remained of the Mary Jane, staring at the bullet holes glinting in the sunlight. He touched the side of the fuselage, whispering, "You saved us." He wasn't speaking to a machine anymore, but to something alive, something that had carried their will across oceans of fire and brought them back when logic said they shouldn't. The Flying Fortress had proven her name and changed the war. March 1943, mid-Pacific. Dawn broke over a restless ocean, the horizon a thin line of gold between sea and sky. Above it, the silhouettes of B-17s cut across the light, majestic, defiant, and already scarred from war. Their formations shimmered in the rising sun, like a migrating flock of metal birds heading east toward destiny. Captain William "Red" Carmichael was back in the cockpit again, flying a new ship, freshly delivered from the States. On the nose, the crew had painted a name in white block letters: "The Last Laugh." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Japanese had laughed once, and it had cost them dearly. Now the laughter belonged to the men who flew these machines, the men who had seen the worst the sky could offer and lived to tell it. Red adjusted his headset, the oxygen mask pressing against his cheek. "Formation check. Everybody tight?" A chorus of voices came through the radio, steady, confident, seasoned. These weren't green kids anymore. These were survivors. Below, their target glimmered faintly in the haze. A convoy of Japanese transports slipping between islets, escorted by destroyers with their guns already elevated toward the heavens. As the bombers descended to attack height, flak began to bloom, black bursts against the morning light. The sound reached them seconds later, sharp concussions that rattled teeth and bones. "Hold her steady," the co-pilot barked. "Bomb bay doors open." Wind howled through the fuselage, whipping through every seam. The bombardier hunched over his sight. "Steady, steady. On my mark." Then, just before release, the radio crackled with static, and a voice they hadn't heard before. A new formation approaching from the north, Japanese fighters vectoring in. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." The zeros came like daggers through the clouds, sleek, fast, impossibly graceful. But this time the fortress crews didn't flinch. The intercoms erupted in gunfire. The air filled with the rhythmic staccato of 12 Brownings per aircraft, pouring out a wall of lead so thick it was said a man could walk across it. Tracer streams wove through the morning light, crisscrossing like lightning bolts. One Zero exploded mid-turn, its wings folding as it fell. Another caught fire and plunged into the sea, its smoke trail glowing orange in the sunrise. Inside the last laugh, Sergeant Daniels shouted from the top turret, "That's 3 down! Keep feeding them!" Red's voice was calm, measured. "Stay in formation. She flies stronger when she flies together." And she did. When the bombs finally dropped, the formation moved as one body. Perfect, disciplined, terrible. Explosions ripped through the convoy below. Ships buckled, fires spread, and columns of smoke rose into the sky. But not every fortress would make it home. One broke formation, trailing smoke and fire. Its tail gunner kept firing until the very end, even as the Pacific swallowed the aircraft whole. Red watched it go down through the side window, his hand tightening on the yoke. "They died in the air," he whispered. "The way we all expected to." Hours later, back at the base, the surviving bombers touched down one by one. Mechanics counted the holes. One ship had taken over 500. Another had lost half a wing. Yet somehow, Impossibly, everyone that had reached the coast had landed safely. On the tarmac, war correspondents snapped photographs, smiling crews standing beside crippled aircraft. Behind them, rows of Japanese bullet scars glimmered like stars. Those photographs would appear in every American newspaper within weeks. The headlines spoke for themselves. They laughed at the fortress, but she laughed last. Across the Pacific, in Japan, the laughter was long gone. Colonel Saburo Takeda, the same pilot who had once mocked the flying fortress over Luzon, now sat in a command room near Truk Lagoon. The walls shook with distant bombing. The lights flickered. Before him, a young officer read a new intelligence report aloud. Fortress raids increasing weekly. New model B-17F entering service in large numbers. Improved defensive firepower. Allied morale high. Takeda said nothing. He only stared at a grainy reconnaissance photograph showing a line of B-17s parked wingtip to wingtip on an island airstrip. Their wings gleamed under the sunlight like a wall of armor. He set the paper down. "They said these machines were slow," he murmured. "But it's not speed that wins wars." "What then, sir?" the young officer asked. Takeda's voice was low, almost reverent. "Endurance." By 1944, the B-17 had become more than a weapon. It was a teacher. Its very existence had forced two empires to understand the difference between dominance and determination. It had taught the Japanese that technology meant nothing without resilience. It had taught the Americans that victory didn't belong to the fastest or even the strongest, but to those who refused to stop coming back. Every battered fortress that limped home across the Pacific carried that message. Every hole in its fuselage was a testament to a truth that transcended the battlefield. Courage, multiplied by 10 men and 4 engines, could defy even gravity. The war was far from over, but the laughter had faded into history. In its place was something deeper, a silent respect shared by enemies who, for a few violent years, had met each other in the sky and tested the limits of what men and machines could endure. And when the last fortress rolled to a stop on a quiet airstrip at the end of the war, her engines ticking down and her skin scorched from battle, she carried with her not just the scars of combat, but the memory of every man who had trusted her to bring him home. The Japanese had called her foolish. Then they had called her fearless. But the men who flew her knew the truth. She was simply a fortress that could fly.